Hi, everyone. Welcome to ANTH 150C Humanity, a How To Guide. So, my name is Dr. Lindsay Montgomery, and I'll be your guide as we delve into the rich world of anthropology throughout the spring semester. So, just as a quick overview, our agenda for today will be some brief introductions about myself and your TAs. We'll talk a little bit about some of the key aspects of the syllabus, but I won't go through the syllabus step by step. So, make sure to actually look at the syllabus on D2L. And if you have any questions about the content or assignments, to reach out to me or your TAs. Then we'll go into just a quick kind of overview about anthropology, a definition of culture, and we'll end today with a debate about cultural appropriation. So let's dive in here. So I am a multiracial uh, woman who grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. I got my undergraduate degree from Columbia in New York City, and I graduated from Stanford in 2015 with a PhD in anthropological archaeology. I've been here at the University of Arizona as an assistant professor now for 6 years. And my research really sits at the kind of intersection of history, cultural anthropology, and archaeology. So I've studied a pretty broad range of topics, including the history of Native American boarding schools during the early 19th century, early 20th century rather, Comanche rock art in New Mexico from the 18th century, indigenous stone tool technologies that date to 5500 BC. And my current work is actually much more in the contemporary period and looks at the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis in the United States and Canada. So, what really unites all of my research and teaching is an interest in Indigenous culture and a drive to create a more equitable and just society through scholarship. Suffice it to say, as my work kind of shows, anthropology is a really broad umbrella that can encompass a lot of different topics, interests, and perspectives. So let's talk a little bit about the content of our class. So you can find all of the readings for this course on D2L. There is no textbook. You don't have to spend any money. All you have to do is go on to D2L, look at each module within our course content page, and then you'll find the classes that have readings, and those readings will be attached. So, as you'll see, there's only one reading a week. This is so light. This is like the lowest amount of reading that you could possibly do in a class. So, the reason why I do that is because I really want you to do the readings. The readings form the basis of the commentaries that you'll get graded on and for our in class discussion. So, please make sure to do the one reading that you have to do for each week, okay? In terms of your attendance and absence policy, basically participation is worth 25% of your grade. That means you get a quarter of your grade just by showing up and participating in class each session. So, how I grade attendance is through a quiz on D2L. So, during class, I'll announce the answer to the attendance quiz for that day. You'll have until the end of the class period, 1:45 p.m., to go on to D2L and answer the quiz question for the day. You can find the quizzes by going on to the D2L homepage, going into quizzes, and you'll see attendance quiz number 1, the date that it's due, and you can click on that quiz to submit your responses. In terms of absences, I'm going to give you guys 4 free absences, which basically means you can miss 2 whole weeks of the semester and not have any penalty to your participation and attendance grade. If you, for any reason, become sick due to COVID or have any other issues that may cause you to be absent from class, please make sure to reach out to your TAs and let them know. And make sure to actually go on to D2L and look at the lecture content that I post and the lecture recordings that I post after each class session so that you can stay up to date on what we're doing during the sessions you have to miss. So, who your TAs are? So, your TAs are Jennifer Byram and Luke Kaiser. Both of them are archaeology PhD students here at the U of A. So, in terms of who you should contact, if you have a last name between A through H, please email Jennifer, and she will be holding office hours every Wednesday at 10 a.m. You can contact her to set up an office hours appointment either through email or by talking to her after class. Those of you with the last name J through Y should email Luke, and he'll also be holding office hours virtually on Wednesdays from 11 to noon. So Luke will be joining and grading our class all virtually, so he won't actually be here with us on a day-to-day basis, but he will be readily available through email. So please don't hesitate to reach out to him. Obviously, as you guys probably know, the TAs are not your personal assistants, and they may actually be in different time zones than you, particularly Luke. So really make sure that if you have a request of your TA in terms of grading or a question, that you make sure to actually plan ahead and give them at least 24 to 48 hours to respond to you. Okay? Your TAs are your first point of contact. If you have a question about the course, about grading, please contact your TAs first. There's 150 of you in this class. If all of you email me directly, it becomes really overwhelming quickly. So if you have a question, make sure to reach out to your TAs first before coming to me, okay? Because if you email me first, I'll likely just send you back to the TAs, okay? All right. One last thing that I want to mention today before we get into our content is the writing assignments. So you guys are tasked with 4 short 3-page double-spaced commentaries on the core themes of the class: race, sports, gender, and globalization. So the goal of these writing assignments is to reflect on the larger themes that we discuss in class and the readings, and to develop arguments about your own opinions and ideas. So these should really not be literature reviews. I don't want you to just regurgitate what you've read or something that I've said in class. I really want you to come up with your own creative arguments about the topic in the prompts for each of these writing commentaries. You will have a chance to revise and resubmit the commentary that you get the lowest grade on. So if you don't get a grade that you don't like for your first commentary, don't worry. You'll have a chance to be able to rewrite it, get comments from the TAs, and resubmit that at the end of the semester for a higher grade. All right? So let's get into the lecture for today. Just to let you guys know, this is a participation heavy class. I know there's 150 of you, but please, I really rely a lot on getting feedback from you guys and doing questions and answers in small groups. So I'm going to start by just throwing out a question to the class. What the fuck is anthropology? If you're watching this online, this will be a time where students will respond and provide points of discussion. Throughout this lecture, I'll break for these kind of discussion questions. So if you're watching it online, make sure to touch base with your TA or another student in the class to get notes for any parts of the discussion that you weren't able to attend. Also, if you're watching this online, this would be a good chance to actually write down some of your own ideas about what you think anthropology is. So most people think anthropology has to do with elsewhere, somewhere exotic, somewhere not where you're from. When I tell people that I'm an anthropologist, they often launch into a story about some show on forensics that they watched on Netflix, or news articles about new discovery in ancient Egypt or somewhere else. What they're thinking about here are biological anthropology, which is the study of human physiology and evolution, and archaeology, the study of material culture left by society. So these are only 2 of the 4 traditional subfields that we think about in North American anthropology. The other two subfields are linguistics and sociocultural anthropology. So, linguistics refers to the study of human language evolution, while sociocultural anthropology refers to the investigation of human behavioral systems, as well as institutions. So, while we will talk about each of these kind of major subfields throughout this class in a little more detail, many anthropologists today, including myself, no longer really subscribe to this kind of four field strict division of the discipline. Instead, we focus much more on themes, as you kind of see in the syllabus, and the different kind of theoretical and methodological ways of studying the human past and present that actually move across archaeology, biological, linguistic, and sociocultural anthropology. So, at the heart of all of these different approaches to anthropological questions is the relationship between nature and culture. So, to give you a sense of what this means, nature and culture in practice, think about some of the ways we identify differences between people. For example, we think about different environments, different genetic makeups, different religious practices, economic systems, or technologies. These differences are often collapsed into a broader category of nature versus culture, with genetics put into the nature box and religion, economics, politics, technology put into the culture box. A really popular notion in anthropology has been the belief that whatever is universal across all human societies must be natural. For example, for a long time, it was believed that Homo sapiens, our ancestors, first developed their kind of modern form, walking on two legs, having large brains, having opposable thumbs, that this was a kind of development that happened independent of culture, and that culture happened after Homo sapiens were fully formed. Now, it's generally accepted that culture actually played a huge role in helping the biological development of our ape ancestors into modern Homo sapiens. So it's not only that humans develop along with culture in this kind of broad sense, but also that we are always within culture in a really particular sense. In short, humans cannot exist outside of culture. Every human society has a culture. So the stylites are one example that proves this rule. So stylites were these hermit-like monks in the 5th and 7th century in what is now Syria and Turkey. And these monks sat on top of pillars to separate themselves from society and devoted themselves to a kind of austere life of prayer. Despite this kind of self imposed isolation, all of these monks had grown up in society during this time in the 5th and 7th century. And even though they rejected the social norms of the time, they were still in conversation with the dominant culture that they were rejecting. So, what the stylites show us is that people are molded by culture from the moment of birth, even if they go on to reject that culture or to take up another culture later on. For a really long time, humanist scholars have basically assumed that there is a constant human nature and that cultural differences between people are actually superficial. For example, we all probably had to read Shakespeare in high school because we've assumed in the United States that we share the same kind of aesthetics, which makes Shakespeare's writing really meaningful universally. But a study by anthropologist Laura Bohannon suggests otherwise. In translating Shakespeare's work Hamlet into an African language, Bohannon encountered many problems with translation, not just words, but actually translating key concepts within Shakespeare's work. Bohannon's study showed that it was almost impossible to translate Shakespeare's world into an African context that made the story understandable without actually fundamentally changing Shakespeare's content. So, to understand humanity, You have to get to the particulars of their culture and not just assume a kind of universal understanding. So this brings us to another core question. What is culture? So this would be another time that if you're here watching us live, that we would be talking in class about your definitions of culture. So go ahead and take a moment and jot down some of your ideas about what you think culture is. Culture is a pretty slippery concept overall, and some anthropologists today think we should drop it altogether. That little whining in the background is my dog Ruby, so I apologize. According to Raymond Williams, culture in its earliest uses was used as a noun to describe the tending of crops or animals. So, agriculture, right? This is where the word comes from. But starting in the 18th century, the idea of cultivation was transferred to humans, and we see the birth of what was considered the cultivated person. This idea of the cultivated person was really closely tied to ideas about civilization and was often associated with great works of art, literature, music, and architecture. During the 19th century, culture was linked up formally with the idea of civilization and came to be seen as something that all people were progressing towards. These kind of ideas about civilization were closely tied to ideas about class and also race, with more quote unquote primitive societies being closer to savagery and barbarism, whereas European societies were closer to civilization. They were cultivated, right? So you see kind of these hierarchies being constructed by anthropologists that place African and indigenous peoples and Aboriginal peoples in Australia on these kind of tiered rungs where they're far from civilization. So by the 20th century, many anthropologists had dropped this kind of hierarchical framework with the realization that different cultures are just different and not more primitive or civilized. The German historian Johann Gottfried von Herder played a critical role in developing a kind of new understanding of culture based on the idea that cultures spring from different core beliefs about life, goals, and values. So von Herder challenged the European model of kind of Western superiority and argued that every people, or what he called a Volk, had their own values, language, and spirit, Geist. So this is where we get the word Volkgeist from, which is a German term for a kind of cultural aesthetic, a cultural worldview. So this is the definition of culture that was picked up and integrated into anthropology by Franz Boas, who is often considered the founder of modern anthropology. So Boas started the first anthropology department in the United States at Columbia University, my alma mater, in NYC. So in American anthropology, culture refers to signifying symbolic or meaning systems. So this can be contrasted with the term social, which refers to institutions and arrangements of people and their activities. So the alphabet, Euclidean geometry, and the story of creation in the Old Testament of the Bible are all examples of culture. They are kind of systems of meaning, while things like the Safeway on Broadway Avenue, the University of Arizona, right, the Vatican, these are all examples of social institutions. So in some ways, this kind of distinction between social and cultural is actually like pretty arbitrary because it's hard to imagine explaining social institutions without the systems of meaning that guide their invention and operation. So for example, like if you're a contractor and you're building a house, you need to have a blueprint, or you need to understand a blueprint by seeing a lot of different houses, right? So there's this kind of relationship between the social and the cultural that makes them really hard to differentiate. So for our class, we're going to think about social and cultural as actually being a united kind of concept. So one of the biggest issues that our society has debated over the past decade has been the issue of cultural appropriation. What I'd like to have you guys do is, if you're alive, to get into small groups with the people around you and have you come up with your own definition of cultural appropriation. Brainstorm some examples. If you're watching this from home, go ahead and take a moment to write down some ideas about what you think cultural appropriation is and some examples of your own that represent good examples of cultural appropriation or bad examples of cultural appropriation. In terms of a kind of formal definition, we can think about cultural appropriation as the practice of taking or using an aspect of someone else's cultural heritage inappropriately or without permission or compensation. So here, cultural heritage could include anything like tangible things like objects, for example, headdresses, or practices, we saw Katy Perry wearing a grill, or expressions or knowledge. Systemic power imbalances created by global imperialism during the 16th through 20th century, along with racism, make it difficult for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color to counter misappropriations. So this has a really negative effect on society because it reinforces stereotypes as sources of discrimination. It allows misrepresentations of, of historically disenfranchised groups, and which undermine their ability to kind of control their own cultural histories and heritage. It really diminishes respect for the sacred. It is also a commercialization of cultural distinctiveness and threatens artistic control and livelihoods. So I'm sure you guys had your own examples of what cultural appropriation is. Here's just a couple that I thought of, right? So a lot of celebrities like Kim Kardashian have been critiqued in the media for braiding their hair into cornrows or for wearing dreadlocks. And they were critiqued that this was a misappropriation of African American hairstyles. The counter argument towards this was that there's lots of different braiding styles that have been traced back over time to different cultures, including in modern day Germany, as well as Egypt and China. Another kind of classic example of cultural appropriation recently has been the Urban Outfitters lawsuit, um, served by the Navajo Nation against their line of Navajo merchandise, which included underwear, jackets, flasks, purses, all made in what they called a Navajo design. So in 2012, the Navajo Nation actually sued Urban Outfitters for violating the Indian Arts and Crafts Act of 1990. And this act basically provides protections for individual artists, and tribal communities to be able to market and brand their own designs to protect it from copyright infringement. So Urban Outfitters claimed that this kind of Navajo design was basically a general style rather than a specific design that could be litigated under copyright law. And so, because it was a general design, Urban Outfitters said anybody can use it, it's not specific. But in 2016, a federal judge in New Mexico actually ordered otherwise and ruled in favor of the Navajo Nation and agreed to basically enforce an agreement between Urban Outfitters and the Navajo Nation to collaborate with the tribe on marketing products in the future. The other big controversy that I thought of was the Dallas show, the Victoria's Secret show, Nomadic Adventures, in which Carly Kloss, depicted here, was shown dressed in animal prints with a mix of kind of Southwest jewelry and a plain style headdress. And she and the show were heavily critiqued by Indigenous activists for cultural appropriation of a sacred object for many Plains communities, the feather headdress. So, the big point that I would make here is that producers have a responsibility to ensure that they acknowledge the source of inspiration and avoid using designs and objects that are culturally distinct or sacred. Free and prior and informed consent is essential to ensuring that the person is in a position to make a decision about the community's culture at a larger scale. And reciprocity is really important here in terms of sharing the benefits, particularly monetary benefits that might accrue from any kind of cultural design that's being marketed. So I'd like you guys, if you're at home, to think about some of the different ways in which you might try uh, to differentiate between appropriation and appreciation, and what we should do as a society to try to minimize the harms that can happen from misappropriation. So that's all I have for you guys today. I look forward to seeing you in our next class on Tuesday. Bye.